Hey everybody, what's going on? There's a lot of interesting discussions right now surrounding the Montreal Canadiens, whether they are tanking, whether they are trying to improve young talent, and I think it really highlights one discussion that hasn't really been had a lot, but really should be had right now, and that's the drafting of Nick Bobrov and what he's done in the past as a director of amateur scouting for a hockey club. I think it's a really fascinating discussion. I think there's some merit to what he has done and what he maybe hasn't done and some of his misses. So I think let's dive into that into today's video and let's discuss his overall track record as an amateur scouting part of an organization. There's certainly been some hits and misses with Bobrov as an amateur scout for an organization, and I think it really depends on how you look at it for what he's done in certain roles. He was with the Boston Bruins, he was with the New York Rangers, and I think there's time to look at some of the good and some of the bad that he's done. I really do think he gets a bad rap, and this isn't really me going to bat for him for his role in the organization, but I do think he gets kind of a bad rap for some of the selections he's made, especially of late with the New York Rangers. They talked about two of the more recent top high-end draft picks, and that's been a problem for him in the past, whether it's players like Vitaly Kravtsov with the New York Rangers or Elias Anderson. Those are two players that certainly haven't panned out in the NHL and don't appear like they're going to pan out, and that's kind of a problem if you're looking at what the Montreal Canadiens are going to do this season. They're likely going to have two selections in the top 15 in the draft, and they need to hit these selections. They need to be players that are going to contribute in the organization, and those players just simply haven't had that impact in the NHL. So these players need to hit, and Bobrov needs to have a big impact in those players hitting because he has a big say in the organization as to what way they lean for draft picks. We all saw the notorious video online of him talking about Uri Slafkovsky and going to bat for him last year, and time will tell if that was the right selection for the Canadiens to make. But moving forward here, he deserves a fresh, clean slate, but you can look at some of the history that he's shown us and what he looks for in players. It appears he does like bigger players that are more skilled, but in my opinion, you can't be sacrificing that skill for size. They need to have both in the organization, but you can't be selecting a player just because they're 6'2 or 6'3 and they're in the conversation in that range. You need to select the best player available at that slot, and you do need to take some chances because odds are enough that you need to be able to hit on these players in order to have those impact players in your organization. If you look at the Stanley Cup winners over the last decade, they all had those impact players in their organizations, and the Montreal Canadiens are certainly missing some of those on their current roster. Look where they are in the standings right now and some of the players that they have moving towards the future, but they're definitely missing that high-end talent, and they need to hit on these selections in order to make the future a lot more brighter than it currently is right now. Sure, they're on the right track, but there's more to be done, and Bobrov will ultimately have a big say in that. So if you look towards two players that he selected recently in the first round, Alexis Lafreniere and Capo Caco with the New York Rangers, there's a lot of discussion about those being misses, and sure, they haven't been bona fide superstars or high-level impact players at the National Hockey League level, but if you talk to scouts around the league or you look at some of the way the rankings were at that time of the draft for those players when they were selected, those would have been the notorious selections for any of the NHL teams on the clock. So I'm not sure that he necessarily deserves the hate or the poor feedback for those selections. Those weren't off the board picks. Those were players that were selected there because that's where they were going to go in that draft year, and they deserve to go in that selection with those draft picks. So I don't believe that he deserves negative feedback for those selections. Sure, they haven't hit, and you have to hit home runs with those selections in the top three, but I don't really believe he deserves that kind of backlash for those selections, because if any other team was in that spot, you're likely going to see them make similar selections. So I don't believe he deserves the hate for those picks, but it is something noteworthy, especially with those players, like I mentioned, Kravtsov and Anderson, that he did select inside the top 10. Those need to be hits this season for the Montreal Canadiens, especially if they're lucky enough to have two in the top 12 or two in the top 10 potentially. They need to have hits on these picks, and they need to be high-end talent for the organization moving forward. And for me, that just means not focusing necessarily on that side. They need to focus on the skill. They need to focus on the hockey sense. They need to focus on how they're going to gel with the current core of the Montreal Canadiens. Look at Lane Hudson for an example. He appears to be a massive steal for the Montreal Canadiens and someone that can be an impactful player in the NHL. He's setting records in college right now with the point production that he's putting up as a defenseman, and that's something the Montreal Canadiens need to focus on. If you have a player potentially that can be a very high-end talent like a Zach Benson in this draft, but he's of the smaller size, You need to really look into that player, see if he has the tenacity to be able to succeed at the NHL level. And if you decide he can, like a Cole Caulfield, sure, there isn't exactly a lot of these small players succeeding at high levels in the NHL. But when you have that super high-end skill like a player like Benson does, you need to take chances on those type of players if they're around when you're on the board in a draft. That's it for me today from Cook's Corner. As always, let me know in the comment section down below what you think of the overall draft track record of Nick Bobrov, and if you think the Montreal Canadiens are headed in the right path with him in charge of amateur scouting. I'm Zach Cook. We'll see you later.